Hello, my name is Georgieff, and I'm a naturalist with the Ocean County Department of Parks and Recreation, and I'm welcoming you here to Wells Mills County Park in Waretown, New Jersey. And we're also located in a larger area known as the New Jersey Pine Barrens. Now that name came into being much earlier in our history when the first settlers came here and found that farming wasn't successful with the crops they were used to growing. The soil was too sandy and too acidic. But they soon found they could pursue other livelihoods with the plentiful resources that were found here. And we're going to talk about several of those that were done right here at Wells Mills County Park. Now, the first one, that's probably the most obvious because of the massive amount of trees we have, is the milling industry or sawmill industry. And James Wells is credited with building the first sawmill here prior to the American Revolution. He built the dam across the Oyster Creek and then built a sawmill to harness the water power in the days before electricity to power equipment, and produced all the products that were needed. Now, this is an example of the tree that was harvested the most. It was Atlantic white cedar. And rather than leaves or needles, it has scale-covered twigs. So it is an evergreen. And this is what a pine tree looks like. It has long needles. So once you've seen the differences, they're pretty easy to tell apart. Now, the thing that makes white cedar so special and so valuable is the wood is very resistant to decay and also the insects. So any product that is going to be used outdoors, this would be the perfect wood for it. So things like fences or shingles. Shingles were probably the single biggest product that were needed in the early days because they're on the outside of a house, and those were the days before vinyl or aluminum siding, asphalt shingles. So almost every house in this area in South Jersey would have had cedar shingles and siding. So this is what a shingle that comes from a sawmill in more recent history looks like. It's cut with a specialized saw, and it has a nice smooth finish, and it's tapered, so it lays nicely against the other shingles and has a nice finish. But in the early days, and before sawmills were as widely prevalent, or not everyone would have had a specialized shingle saw, they would have been made by hand. So what they would do is take a section of cedar wood, usually a little bigger than this one, and then they would have a tool called a froe, F-R-O-E, and it has a blade on one side. They would first take the log and square it off. They would do that 4 times. Then they would be left with something that looked like this, again, much bigger. Oops, sorry. Then from there, they would split individual shingles. And this one already has a little bit of a taper. It just came out naturally, but usually they would have to get a pile of these. Then they would have a specialized bench with a foot-powered clamp, and a special bladed tool with 2 handles would be used to smooth this out and put the taper on it. So there was a lot of handwork that went into each shingle. Once they came out with the shingle saws, these type, you could make several dozen in 1 minute. So this was a big advantage. But these were usually much thicker, and then they would last, 25 or even 50 years if they were made thick enough, because again, cedar lasts a long time. And you will still find cedar shingles on many houses. Another product that's used outdoors would have been boats. They're not just outdoors, but used in the water. And I have a couple models of some boats that were invented right here in Ocean County. This is called the Garvey, and it's a flat bottom boat. So if a clammer or an oyster harvester or oysterman were doing those activities out in the bay and they were standing near the edge, it wouldn't tip over because it was so flat. A round bottom boat would roll if you stood and worked near the edge. And these could also carry a lot of weight. So they could be filled with clams, oysters, crabs, fish. So these were working boats. They were almost like the pickup truck of the bay. Another boat that was invented here in Ocean County was the Barnegat Bay sneak box. And these miniature little decoys give you a little idea of what these were used for. This was a duck hunting boat. So the hunter would, despite the name, they didn't sneak up on the ducks. They would pull this up against the salt marsh, put their duck decoys out in the water, cover the boat with grass and hide inside, and lure the ducks close enough to harvest. Then, just like the fish, clams, oysters, the ducks would be shipped often by rail to as far away as New York or Philadelphia. And that was a common thing that people made for a living. So not only did they build boats for a living, but they duck hunted, and they also made duck decoys. This is a duck decoy that was made in Manahawkin by Rube Corliss. He passed away back in the 70s. He was one of the old-time carvers. And this is made of Atlantic white cedar. This would be going in the water, used, and then taken out. So that would be an environment where the wood would rot if it was made from pine or some other type of wood. So the cedar was a very good wood for that product. Now, another occupation that was pursued here at Wells Mills was clay mining. Most of the Pine Barrens soil, for anybody that's gardened or dug in their yard, is very sandy. And it's good for making concrete, and also glass, but not much else. This is some clay I dug up just this morning at Wells Mills, and you could see it kind of holds its shape when you squeeze it. It's kind of plasticky. And this could be refined and the clay separated from the other objects or impurities. And then here it was taken by wagon to the Tuckerton Railroad, a little bit north of here. And then from there it was shipped to Trenton, where it was used to make pottery and fine china. The clay here was very good quality. But other areas, it might have been turned into bricks, which we're all familiar with. There were brick yards and clay pits to harvest clay for bricks all over the Pine Barrens. Also, clay pipe. This came from a factory in Manchester called the Wheatland Clay Works. Now many people know it as Pasadena, which was a failed real estate development which occurred later. But this is a section of clay pipe. You could see the wider part where the narrow end of the next section would have fit into it, and would be used for either sewers or water. Then they also used bog iron to make iron pipe for those same purposes as well. So this was done here, and we still have some of the old clay pits near our nature center that some of our nature trails go along. What the purpose that they serve now that's very important is vernal ponds. A vernal pond is a pond that the water does not stay in all year long. During the heat of the summer, it dries up. So the reason that can be important is many of our animal species, like frogs and toads, amphibians that have the early stages of their life in the water, they can breed in those ponds, but because the water is not there all year long, there won't be a fish population to eat the eggs or the tadpoles. So vernal ponds are very important to many of our amphibian species, including rare ones like the Pine Barrens tree frog. Next, I want to show you some moss. Now, this is just moss. People see it all over, but this one is special. This is called Spagna Moss. And one of the things that makes Spagna Moss so valuable is it's very absorbent. So watch if I squeeze some of it. You can see the water coming out. And there's many types of sphagnum, but most can hold over 20 times their weight in water. So humans found very many uses for a product that's so absorbent. It's known that the Native Americans would make baskets out of twigs or split branches for their babies and line them with sphagnum moss. They would dry it out first, of course. So it was sort of like hamster bedding for their babies. And then later on, it was found that because it had antiseptic qualities as well as being absorbent, it could be used as a wound dressing. And that kind of fell out of use after a while, but then by World War I, there were shortages of cotton because of the uniforms, blankets. It was even used in manufacture of explosives. And they were finding that they didn't have enough effective wound dressings for the soldiers that were injured in battle. So on both sides of the war, the armies began going back to dressings made of sphagnum moss, and they were found to be very effective because not only was the sphagnum twice as absorbent as the cotton wound dressings, but they were naturally antiseptic, so it helped prevent infections of the wounds. So then later on after the war, it fell out of use again because modern medicines and antibiotics became prevalent, so sphagnum wasn't used for that purpose anymore. But it's still used to this day. It's used in the florist industry for floral arrangements, similar to a green styrofoam that you may get a flower arrangement in now. Also, bare root seedlings are shipped in them. If you buy plants mail order, it's much cheaper to bundle a bunch of seedlings together without the soil and wrap a little sphagnum moss around them than it is to have each one in a pot, which weighs more and costs more to ship. It's also used to make soil or seed starting mixes and potting soil because it will hold moisture and also prevent some of the diseases that seedlings get. And they sell bales of it for a soil amendment. When you mix this in with your soil, it's like adding millions of little sponges in that sandy soil that we have. So our vegetables, flowers, and even lawns can grow much better without using as much water. And the interesting thing about this is because of its acidity, it will also preserve things for a long time. So in Northern Europe, they found human mummies buried in peat bogs when they were harvested for fuel, for burning. And normally we think of mummies being in arid areas like Egypt, but they can also be preserved not just by dry conditions, but also by wet, acid conditions. So if you go online and search for bog mummy or bog man, you'll find some interesting pictures of some of the mummies they've discovered that were believed to be thousands of years old in the peat bogs. So that's about all we have for today, but I do invite you, once we resume our activities after the current medical crisis is over, to look for some of our van trips. One of our more popular ones goes throughout the Pine Barrens and visits many of the company towns that pursued these, as well as many other activities such as iron and glass manufacture, paper making, blueberry and cranberry growing. And many of these areas are long abandoned, long forgotten, but we know where they are and we can take you there to see them. Also, I invite you to join us this Friday as we visit Caddis Island, and Nikki Vernaccio will do another presentation. But until then, stay safe.